Our next speaker is Peter Weyand, and his presentation is entitled Marathons, Milestones, and Moonshots, the Science of Human Performance in the Era of Cheating. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Am I? Okay.
Please.
Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to you today about not magical money like the last speaker, but the magical powers of science to enhance human performance. I'm part of a project that's targeting the 2-hour marathon historic barrier for human performance that's much like the quest to break the sub-4-minute mile in terms of the attention and the significance sort of for human performance more broadly. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today in Boston to speak to you about this, in part because of my personal roots in Boston. I grew up in this area. My parents are from this area. I grew up watching the Boston Marathon. There's Bill Rogers, Boston Billy, in the late 1970s, running down Boylston Street. And of course, this is a community, for those of you that are from here, that embraces running in the marathon. And also my professional roots run through the Boston area. I'm at Southern Methodist University in Texas now. I've been in Texas for over a decade. But my professional training came in the formative professional training. Most of it came in the biology department at Harvard University. There's a Concord Field Station lab that is part of that department that is located out in Bedford, about 20 miles west of here, where I had the good fortune to be a researcher there for a period of over 10 years. And we ran all sorts. It was a comparative locomotion lab. So we ran animals of all different sorts on treadmills: lions, cheetahs, wolves. That's a picture of my mentor in the middle there, Dick Taylor, the former director of the lab, riding a llama on a treadmill. But through the years, we did pronghorn antelope, kangaroos, you name it. And so some of that spirit, that can-do spirit that you could imagine for, dream it up, get the animals, train them, run them on the treadmill, acquire data to look at really sort of basic scientific questions about how things work. Some of that same can-do spirit has translated to the 2-hour marathon project in a more human context. And so what you see in the bottom right-hand corner is sort of the end result of that training and spirit for the sub-2-hour marathon project. You see it's one of our athletes, Kenenisa Bekele, who's arguably the best distance runner who ever lived, who's working with the project right now. Kenenisa holds the world record at the 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, and he is right now #2 on the all-time marathon list, and he's brave enough to work with a bunch of scientists and let us dictate his training, among other things. In terms of the breakdown of the talk, there's 4 different sections. I'll give you a little bit of the research background, the flavor of it. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about the science of marathon running. We won't do a deep dive because this is a general audience and I have 30 minutes. And then a little bit about the environment, because there are aspects of the Sub-2 Marathon project, which is a consortium, an international consortium of scientists and others throughout the world, to try to take a different approach to human performance that we feel is needed in the contemporary era, both to better utilize science and to combat some of the not positive influences in sport that are present today in Olympic and other sports, and then I'll conclude. So, research background. Our lab at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, in many respects, is a human performance lab built in the model of the Concord Field Station at Harvard. And we have this same equipment. We take the same kind of measurements. In the middle there, you see our high-speed treadmill. It's one of a kind in the world. It will go 90 miles an hour, and it measures forces instantaneously of foot-ground contact 1,000 times a second. So you see an athlete there, a sprint athlete on the right-hand side, running at a high speed with reflective markers. This started out at the field station. We actually started doing very high-speed testing. When we got pronghorn antelope, we went to Colorado with some vans, brought some antelope back, trained them to run on our treadmills. And to give you a frame of reference, the pronghorn antelope They're the second fastest land animal, but they are the best endurance animal out there. So they run at over 30 miles an hour for 15 minutes at altitude. So a pronghorn antelope, unlike the human runners, could finish a marathon in about 45 minutes. This will give you a touch of the lab at Harvard, I hope. If this footage plays, it was playing fine earlier.
40 miles an hour on the treadmill for us.
This is some footage from animals
For
at
an
Harvard
animal
lab.
to increase speed, there are basically two ways it can do it. One is it can take longer steps or more steps per minute. What animals actually do is sort of a compromise, particularly within a run or a trot. Most of the increase comes from taking longer strides, and it simply spends more time in the air and less on the ground to go faster.
What is it you're trying to find out by running these animals on the treadmill?
Well, one of the most interesting things is that we found that all animals use their muscles and tendons as springs when they run.
When an animal hits the ground, it stores the energy of impact in its legs. And it uses this energy to help push off the ground on its next stride.
Okay, so that was my
Have you
former
learned anything, Dick?
mentor, Dick Taylor. And you saw some of the animals that we ran. The ostrich was a little difficult on the days it didn't want to be as cooperative. But as I said, there was a CanDo Spirit, to get these animals to perform as we needed to. And so that spirit has transferred over as well as the scientific approach. So I wanted to go there. My PhD is in a human performance area, but I wanted to get in that lab to study the things and learn from Dick Taylor, who is the world's leading physiological authority on locomotion, and I was fortunate enough to spend 10 years as a researcher there and learn those techniques and then bring them back to study human performance. So whether it's animal sprinters like the cheetah or an animal endurance runner like the pronghorn antelope, the scientific principles, Newton's laws of motion, apply to human athletes in the same way. And of course, movement and motion is the basis of performance, whether you're Usain Bolt running 100 meters or you're a marathoner that wants to break a 2-hour barrier. Those scientific rules are the same. So part of the reason I was so eager to be a researcher at the field station with Dick Taylor in the lab at Harvard, which was world known throughout the world as sort of the hub of animal exercise physiology, was to take those techniques and apply them to humans. And so it's not just the laws of motion, but what's less obvious is that the biology of force production and force application to the ground, which is what determines movement and performance, those things are also common because the tissues, the musculoskeletal tissues, muscle, tendon, and bone, is built of the same structural materials, and it works the same way in a cheetah, in an antelope, and in you and me. So the basic scientific principles are the same, and I had a good foundation in learning how to use them there. So here's a wolf pictured as a running machine, and in many respects, we would use that analogy all the time. So the energy pathways, for example, the amount of energy an animal gets from oxygen going into its mouth to support running and throughout its system and delivered to the muscles where it's converted to chemical energy, that amount of energy is the same in a wolf or a cheetah or a pronghorn antelope as it is in you or me or any other human athlete, because the chemical pathways that convert the oxygen to the usable form of muscular energy are the same. And so there are also commonalities for the mechanics. This is the wolf, and this is on the left, and Jeremy Warner, who some of you may know Jeremy's a 3-time Olympic gold medalist, 4th fastest human ever at 400 meters. But also because of the commonalities in the mechanics of the physics and the musculoskeletal tissues, the motions of the body, the oscillating motions of the body in the different animals, whether they're quadrupedal or a bipedal runner like a human or an ostrich, those are also the same, and the patterns of force application on the ground are also similar. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you a test we've done in the lab with a sprint athlete at a very high clip to drive home what we do, how we take measurements and what measurements that we take. And what you'll notice is how quickly these things happen in real time. This is slow motion. Hopefully that'll play better the next time. See if it'll come back for us. There we go. Just under 27 miles an hour, right? So that track and field athlete, so one of the things that you'll notice is how loud that sound was. So how hard a runner hits the ground, or any other athlete in any context, determines how fast they move. So the speed athletes, what they have to do is hit really hard in relation to their body weight to go fast. An endurance athlete has to hit relatively hard in relation to its body weight to win a marathon race or to get to the line under 2 hours, even though that level of force is not quite as high. So this next clip will break that down a little bit for you, sort of the physics of motion that underlie performance. This is from a recent study we just published.
This is world champion and gold medalist in the 110-meter hurdles, David Oliver, running at 10.2 meters per second on the SMU high-speed force treadmill. We simultaneously record ground reaction forces and video at 1,000 frames per second. To run fast, sprinters apply forces up to 5 times their body weight in less than 100 milliseconds on each leg. Here's distance runner Ryan Hall, the fastest American marathoner in history, running at 5.7 meters per second, a 2-hour and 3-minute marathon pace. He has a different force pattern, lower in amplitude and longer in duration than a sprinter. During a marathon, Ryan will impact the ground 25,000 times with a peak force of 3 times his body weight for each footfall. Running ground reaction forces thus have fundamental physical and biological significance. Is there an underlying principle that relates the force to the motion of a runner? There is. Newton's laws of motion.
Okay, so what we do is, there's a reason that we collect data, both motion and force data, 1,000 times a second, because you can see how quickly those things happen in real time. And one of the things that we need to do is break that down in fine detail to economize. For the distance runners, if we're going to get a marathoner under 2 hours, we need to know everything about force production on the ground, because that is what determines the energy that they expend, how much energy they have, and how ultimately, how hard they hit the ground and how fast they go is an energy game with the marathoners, as I'll explain a little bit going forward. So how do we get involved in this? It's kind of a natural fit in terms of the vision, as I told you, but because of kind of the cowboy science that we do, and we're the only ones that really specialize on the mechanics of performance, as we do in the sort of context that we do, Yannis Pitsalatis, who's the project lead on the sub-2-hour marathon project. Yannis approached us about 2 years ago, and he's been working on this vision for over 5 years. He's mortgaged his house twice to pay for it, to get it off the ground. He epitomizes, like, we are going to get this done kind of guy. So Yannis reached out to us and said, hey, look, we need you guys in the cowboy science that we do if we're going to break this barrier. And he's assembled a group of about 8 different scientific specialists, nutrition, biochemistry, et cetera, to try to come together to break this barrier. So that is the vision. So I said, sign me up, let's go. This is too much fun to pass up. But Yannis brings a couple of very important credentials to this beyond the vision. So number one, he is the world's leading authority on the genetic basis of human performance. So how many of you have heard of David Epstein's book, Sports Gene? Have some of you read it? Okay, so there's 2 chapters in there just devoted to Yannis. The other credential he brings that's critically important for the modern environment is Yannis is the leading anti-doping scientist in the world. And part of our project, one of the fundamental things that we're embracing with it is clean sport. So, and Yannis he's one of those people that just won't be denied. So this is him floating in the Dead Sea over there on the right. There was a great piece by Jerry Longman in the New York Times, long-form article on the marathon project, our sub-2 marathon project that appeared last May. You can Google it, still read it online. That captures Yannis' spirit and the spirit of the project. That's Yannis running along the Dead Sea, where the oxygen, because of the low altitude, the oxygen is really dense there, so that's a good place to try to break 2 hours, because you can get a little bit more oxygen into the system. Not a lot, but a little. And that's Yannis timing Kenenisa Bekele in Ethiopia as part of the project in the lower right, which was this slide that you saw, picture you saw on the cover slide. So, and he's tireless. So this is a facility that's been set up. Another part of the project, in addition to how important the anti-doping is that we want to bring the science of performance to environments in developing countries where it doesn't exist. So this is our lab space in Kenya, and we also have lab space in Ethiopia. Over the longer haul, the template, we would like to expand it to places like the Caribbean, where sprinting athletics is a really big deal, and have sports science become available in the developing world the same way it's available currently to professional athletes and team sports and in most of the Western world. So this is the Ethiopia facility. So we're in the process of raising funds to to build out these labs with all the equipment that we like to provide sports science as a developmental tool in those environments. So these are the athletes that are working with the project. Some of this is just progress to date. So I mentioned Kenenisa, who's probably, by any reasonable standard, objective measures, the best distance runner ever lived, who's fully on board with the project. Wilson Kipsang, who's also one of the top marathoners in the world, certainly probably top 5. Wilson won the Tokyo Marathon just last week, about a minute off the world record. Under windy conditions in Tokyo, he ran a 1.5 minutes faster than anybody in Japan. And the buy-in from these guys is really important. So having Kenenisa say, I'm going to let scientists dictate what I'm going to do, is a big deal to get the others to follow. And there's a couple of Kiwi athletes that we have on the project that are world-class, but slightly more developmental than Wilson and Kenenisa. The Robertsons brothers, who are in Ethiopia training as part of the project now, they're already world-class. They're much younger, so their upside is theoretically at least higher. So just like sort of the sub-4 minute mile barrier, if we think about what happened then where the attention of the world was on this, the attention of the world is now on the sub-2 barrier, but it's a very different environment. When Roger Bannister broke the 4 minute mile, there was no such thing as sports science, right? And so even the presence of all of us at this conference, right? In 1954, when Bannister broke the 4 minute mile, there was not only there was no such thing as sports science. In a conference like this, you couldn't even think of it, right? So, but today, the fact that we're all here and that there is a sports analytics conference like this is testament to everybody buying in to the scientific process and the value analytics have for improving performance, right? Whether it's ticket sales, like the last speaker, figuring out how to sell more tickets, performance in a business realm, or performance of the human body in a scientific realm, we're in a different environment. And so part of the Sub-2 project is an attempt to capitalize, to take the good things that we can pull out of science and also use this barrier, the historic barrier of a 2-hour marathon, with a concentrated scientific effort to do it in a clean sport way that addresses some of the problems that exist in contemporary sport today, and I'll get to that a little bit more toward the end. The next thing I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of the science and how we do this, just a brief breakdown on the science of marathoning performance and where our efforts are focused to try to make these endurance runners faster. So you saw the ground reaction forces from Ryan Hall in the earlier video. Ryan ran the fastest ever American marathon here in Boston. He's now retired. But the whole secret is that pattern of force application on the ground, right, that makes the runner move, right? For the endurance runners, what you have to do to have them go faster, you saw that it's 25,000 steps, right, for a marathon, and it's 3 times body weight with every bang on the ground, right? So you have to economize that. You have to make the energy cost of applying force as low as possible. So one of the things that we want to do is understand the nature of that waveform to understand how best to economize it. So one quick and dirty that you can all relate to is the distance runners, right? They're all built like this, right? They're ectomorphs. They're bean poles, right? And the reason that they're bean poles is they obviously don't want to carry any extra weight because that force on the ground is set by how much you weigh. So if you gain 2 pounds, that waveform on average is going to bump up 2 pounds. And if you lose 2 pounds, it's going to go down 2 pounds. So part of the reason the distance runners don't carry any extra weight is because it minimizes how much force they need to move. But there are other aspects of it that are critically important scientifically. So at the high level, we can break down the science of endurance performance in running or any other sport as a supply and demand problem, right? So for sprinting, it's a different ballgame. For them, it's just force and transmission of force to the ground to go fast. They don't care if they burn energy. But endurance events are energy limited. They're limited ultimately by the rate at which our body can turn over energy to put that force into the ground. So we use the analogy of an automobile, supply and demand. This is Paula Radcliffe on the left. That's a women's world record holder in the marathon. And so for endurance runners, the science boils down to something really simple. It's how much energy do they have, horsepower to turn it over, and what their fuel economy is. So the automobile analogy works really well, and it is basically a supply and demand problem. We use the automobile analogy. The supply is how big is their metabolic power or their metabolic engine, like the horsepower in a car, and the other part of it is their fuel economy, right? How far can they go on a given amount of oxygen, or how much oxygen does it take for them to cover a mile or to run at a certain speed. And so it really is essentially the inversion of gas mileage, which you're all accustomed to in that automobile analogy. So we can do this in the lab. So we can also do it in the field, whether it's with elephants at the Atlanta Zoo, pioneering experiments with human athletes on a track back in the 1960s at altitude with Jim Ryan. That's an ultramarathoner at the Harvard lab that we tested probably 20 years ago now, 15 years ago. And what you're seeing there is a technique to measure the rate of oxygen going into their body, which tells us how much energy they need and how much they're using. So this is a Kenyan athlete in our lab at SMU. This is Silas Kipruto. You can see the mouthpiece and the headgear. Silas is a world-class runner. He's run a half marathon in about 59.5 minutes, so he's halfway to our full marathon goal. And so what we do with those measurements that you just saw from Silas is we measure both the supply and the demand components for these endurance athletes. So the most important thing, the variable, is the velocity at VO2 max. So what you're seeing on the y-axis is the rate at which oxygen is going into their body, which we're measuring from the mouthpiece. And we do it at a constant running speed, so we know how much oxygen do they need to run at that speed. And then we keep running them faster and faster until we have them run faster and their oxygen uptake no longer goes up. We know we've maxed them out, and we have a measure of their metabolic or aerobic horsepower. And once we have that, we can assign a speed for their velocity at what we call VO2 max, or their aerobic maximum, that max rate of oxygen uptake. And that is all important for endurance athletes. So this is one of the pioneers in our field, Jack Daniels, who worked for Nike for a long time in their exercise physiology lab. Jack's measurements indicate that marathon runners, when they perform well, they all run at 85% of that lab measurement of velocity at VO2 max, right? And it's really tight. They run at 85%, like plus or minus 1% or less. So unless they cramp or step in a pothole or something else, if they have a good day and they pace well, that's where they come in. So we can take a laboratory measurement and we know exactly how fast they can run a marathon based on those scientific measures, right? So our job as part of the Sub-2, the scientific effort, the cowboy science that we do, and the reason that Giannis reached out to us is really to reduce that demand. We want to improve force application and reduce that energy cost. So if we do that by 10%, the velocity at VO2 max, their max aerobic running speed goes up 10%, and their marathon performance will improve by 10%, right? So are we going to get 10% with the techniques available to us? No. But if we can bump that 2 or 3%, if we bump it 3%, we're under 2 hours, right? So really the focus is on musculoskeletal force application, as you saw with Ryan and David Oliver, to economize that. We want to reduce that energy cost as much as we possibly can. And the secrets to that we know. One of the reasons that the East Africans are so dominant in the endurance events, it's not their aerobic horsepower, right? They're normal. They're like athletes from Asia, athletes from Western Europe or the US, Western Europe descent. They're no different in their horsepower. What's different about them is they run really cheap. And some of that is, you see Silas over here on the left, some of that's having a really long shank with long tendons that don't use energy and a little itty-bitty muscle that generates force without using a lot because it's so small. That's a motif that you see in endurance and sprint athletes, actually. It's relatively short musculature and long tendons, so that's part of it. But we want to maximize force application on the ground. There's a way that the body comes down, is caught, and bounces back up that's going to be most economical. We're trying to figure out the exact signature for that right now. And the shoe ground force, the shoes at the foot ground force, point of foot ground force application are also important. So there's a lot of tension from shoe companies on this, as you might imagine. I'll talk about that tiny bit going forward. The last thing I'm going to do here, the last part of the talk before I conclude, is a step back to give you some sense of, I think I've endowed you a bit with the spirit of the project, but I want to give you some sense of kind of the larger rationale. So there's a moonshot element to it, right? There's this historic performance barrier, which is cool because you just want to know, can humans do that? Can a human run a marathon in under 2 hours? The same way people wanted to know that about a 4-minute mile. But there's also, you have to answer hard questions. I mean, we all, the scientists in the project, we all work for not-for-profit institutions that have, a public mission to benefit the public. To whatever extent we embrace that and try to live it out in our daily professional lives. So you might ask a hard question like, how does that really benefit mankind? I mean, that's good for your imagination. You might break that barrier, but really at the end of the day, what is the value of that? So part of the answer to that question is what you learn along the way that can be applied to other things, other athletes, other endeavors, to improve performance, to reduce injuries, to use knowledge in positive ways. But part of our mission with this project is also to try to do sports science in a different way. So we've got a consortium, we've got ambition to raise a lot of money, we're partway there, we haven't raised as much as we'd like to fully resource the project. But one of the things that's responsible for convening us all here is that we all recognize the power of science and analytics to transform sport. And when Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute miles, they said there was no such thing as sports science, right? But now, what's happening is that, there's a lot of talk about disruption, right? Disruptive technologies, right? Disruptive applications on your phone, and part of what goes on here is forecasting in the business world about what the next big thing is going to be, whether it's electronic or other. But in the long haul, if you step back and you think about what's happened in sports science, these are Olympic examples, but science is massively disrupting science and the technology that it spawns. Right? And it causes all kinds of problems with basic equity. Like sports should have integrity, it should be fair, right? People don't like unfair sport, it kind of undermines the principle of the whole thing. And so these are different examples, right? These are from Olympic sports. I don't have to talk about PEDs, everybody knows about their presence, right? The clap skates in the Olympics, Winter Olympics, they're legal. They improve performance by about 3%. Low friction swimsuits, do any of you know that story? So they came in, right, and they blew up the swimming record book, to the point where a German guy beat Michael Phelps, and he said, look, I'm not better than Michael Phelps, I just have a better suit, right? So they outlawed the suits, and they put all the records back. Prosthetic limbs, you know the controversy with Pistorius before the 2012 Olympics, which we were right in the middle of, and his limbs did enhance performance, although it didn't shake out that way in terms of the decisions necessarily for policy. It was clear from the data that he had an advantage, but the sporting authorities said, okay, go ahead and run. But that scene has moved to Marcus Rem, a German long jumper who's actually more competitive, right, in the long jump than Pistorius was in the sprints. Marcus Rem's best long jump would have won the gold medal in the 2012 London Olympics. So these issues are still brewing, right? And these are just some examples. It's performance-enhancing drugs, it's technology, but it's not just limited to Olympic sports. It tends to get more attention there. But we've had steroid era in baseball, right? We've had human growth hormone, depending on who you listen to. Half the players in the NFL are on it. And we had the Deflategate, right, scandal, which is an indication, right? So that's kind of technical doping, whatever you believe about whether it occurred or not. But people care about fairness in sport. And right now, the regulators and administrators are way behind the curve. They always have been. It's more true in the game sports, professional sports, than it is in the Olympic sports. But the Olympic sports have better institutions set up to deal with this stuff, but they are failing. So part of our project with Sub2, I'm not going to claim that we're going to remedy it, but we would like to have a positive influence and do the science in a responsible way with this consortium, where we can do two things. There's an anti-doping component to it, which is very strong, but there's also a dedicated scientific effort to offer a doping alternative. So we all embrace evidence-based practice and analytics, but we have not had prior opportunities to have large-scale human performance projects where we identify what the best clean training practices are. So the whole anti-doping scene, right, the whole clean sport initiative worldwide that's happened primarily because of the Tour de France and Olympic sports, that effort has been focused entirely on catching cheaters. There's been almost no attempt to develop clean sport alternatives that work. So that's one of the things that we're doing with this project. And a quick note that what started out, and then I'm about to close, as a kind of a kooky endeavor among scientists to break a 2-hour marathon. When Giannis started mortgaging his house a long time ago, people thought he was nuts. And as we made the rounds and tried to gin up support for this, Nike and Adidas both took a long look at it and said, hey, we're interested, and then they ultimately said no. And then a little bit after they said no, last December, Nike came out and said, we're going to break the 2-hour marathon. Here's our team to do it. We put together scientists and athletes. So as of December, they're in the race with us, and Adidas quickly followed suit. unlike scientists that work not-for-profits, they're coming at this from a commercial angle. But part of it is just the value proposition of that historic barrier, right? So since I'm winding down on time and I want to leave you time for questions, I'm just going to move ahead. I've basically described to you the different nature of our endeavor, that we are trying to use it as a clean sport, positive alternative, and that it's new. What you have are scientists in charge of, right, the training and the organization of the lives of these athletes in the project, which is inverted from what we have in pro sports in America, where the administrators make the decisions about what the sports scientists do. We've flipped that model and tried to do it on a bigger scale. And so the last thing I'm going to do is just talk to you about, make 2 points to wrap up and hopefully leave time for questions. One is that the future of sport really depends on the relationship with science and technology. And on one extreme, if I simplify this, there's a pharmaceutical gene doping freak show where it's nothing but gladiator sport. Down the other path, there can be a clean, ethical sport where we maintain competitive integrity, and sport can be something that we want our kids to do, rather than something we want our kids to stay away from, right? So that's part of the mission of this. As I said, we're not going to clean it all up, but one thing that's important is to do that step back and recognize in a place like this that the future of sport, what form it takes, and how healthy as an endeavor it is, really depends at this point in the relationship with science because of the control that science gives us over the outcomes. So in conclusion, we're going to beat Nike and Adidas to the goal. Of course, I probably didn't have to tell you that. Science and technology will continue to advance human performance. It's a fundamental driver now. But the health of that relationship for Olympic sports and team sports and sport in general depends on the relationship between science and technology and sport and how well it's governed and regulated. Thank you. Question over here? Well, Alberto Salazar is a beautiful, and the Nike Oregon project, how many of you know about this scandal? Or I'm not sure I should call it a scandal, controversy, is a good example. So, you know, if you look at what's out in the public arena, some of which has just been released through the Russian hackers, probably because they want to deflect attention from how bad the Russian doping scandal is that by all appearances, the facts that are out there suggest that what was going on was attempts for the most part to do everything possible to gain advantage by any means, pharmaceutical or others, but stay within the rules. So with the carnitine that you mentioned, it's legal. And so they knew it was legal, but you know, through trial and error, like, oh, this stuff has a big performance bump. So one of the things they released was Salazar sending emails to Lance Armstrong before he was busted, saying, Lance, you got to try this stuff. It's unbelievable, right? So that comes right back to the difficulties of regulation. So part of the difficulty is keeping up with what helps performance and what doesn't. And this was in the middle of the Pistorius controversy also with the prosthetic limbs. The Court of Arbitration for Sport had to decide with only the evidence that it had, does he have an advantage or does he not? So often they're deciding with incomplete evidence. And so things are moving so quickly that it's tough to keep up with the regulation. But the discouraging thing is that they're not trying. So the Olympic sports have institutions to deal with it, like the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Professional sports in this country don't. And so like the baseball scandal, they stuck their head in the sand. And you have a situation with the NFL Players Union where the players don't want to get tested for HGH because they don't want to stop taking it because they're afraid if I can't take it and the other guy can't take it, I'm at a disadvantage. So that's really not where those issues should be. And that makes my point of there's a compelling need to get in front of these issues rather than behind them because we lose control of what form sport takes. So hopefully that wasn't too long an answer to your question. Yes, here. So could you shorten that? Could you ask the question for me again? I'm not sure I have the question part of it.
So obviously, so much of it's going to be about doing it on the right course and in the right environment. The other one, how much effort can you make in a lab to be able to replicate the ideal conditions that they're going to do?
How much lab effort will we make? So the lab is really sort of a testing evidence. You know, it's a test environment. So we don't need to replicate in the lab what they're going to do out there in 2 hours. We sort of know the performance metrics well enough. The lab's a useful tool to give us controlled conditions to evaluate shoe mechanics, force application mechanics, but we don't need to replicate the environmental conditions. We know enough about that science to know, all right, outside the lab, when we translate to this environment with this much wind or that much oxygen, what's going to happen? That was a good question. Yes?
What applications, if any, have you found for the serious recreational runner? The moonshot is a great metaphor for this. It's a bit unfortunate that the shoe brands themselves couldn't find a common social good to work with. The cities would have another expectation for that. But the moonshot also threw off a lot of technologies and applications that were still benefiting from the space program. Have you guys found anything right now? Do you anticipate anything going further? Any of that you can disclose and couch in terms of IP? Because if Nike's going to do something on its own, as you say they announced, a lot of times they do that because they want to own certain intellectual property and they're incentivized to do that for the shareholder value and all that. Are you guys claiming IP and do you see any applications for serious?
Yeah, so great question. So there's a consortium of about 8 different scientists involved in this. So we're all sort of doing science in our area. So we generate IP in those areas. So to come directly to your point, we have IP that was kind of generated from the mechanics portion of our project that we're involved in doing before we started with the Sub-2. We have IP, and so the video I showed at the beginning with David Oliver and Ryan Hall, that applies to force application mechanics by recreational runners that they can use to monitor their own performance or injury status, et cetera. Are we out of time?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you for your attention.